Well, thank you, Danny, for inviting me. Following my good friend Leon's remarks, in a way I will be underlining them, and I will probably not go over my time. I should introduce myself the way he did. I'm also a university professor at the other university in Alberta. My family's been here. Well, my dad's family, my great-grandfather was a homesteader down near Millerville, and he was from Ontario, and he married an Aboriginal woman here. So I guess I've been here forever. My mom's family was from Newfoundland, and my maternal grandfather always spoke of Canada as a foreign country. It's an attitude that my paternal grandfather also shared. I can remember discussions when I was a kid about social credit. And both my grandfathers were agreed that it had nothing to do with socialism. But beyond that, they were mystified. One lived in BC and one lived in Alberta, so you can understand why they might be a bit confused about what social credit meant. Now, before discussing my assigned topic as a kind of introduction to it, which is 5 challenges to independence, I'd like to suggest some context. And when you reflect on the context, you'll see there's really one major challenge to independence. First, consider a column by Terry Corcoran in the Financial Post last week. He wonders what planet Laurentian Canadians are living on when they conducted an election that featured serious debate on ending fossil fuel use in a couple of decades. He reminded his readers that this country was built on natural resource extraction. Some were renewable, like beavers and cod and grain and trees. Some not, like uranium, gold, and hydrocarbons. And the election featured heated debates over pipelines. As we know, the TMX expansion loop would add 600,000 barrels a day of delivered oil on the West Coast. That is 0.6% of global production. No other country in the world is debating reducing the production of fossil fuels. And no one in their right mind would give a hoot about 0.6% of an increase. I would note that Iran just announced the discovery of 53 billion barrels in a new oil field. If that's correct, and who wants to believe the Iranians, Canada is now in 4th place, not 3rd. But 170 billion barrels is still pretty big. I'd also note that for last August, Texas announced a 20% increase in oil and gas production. Alberta production increased 2%. For the past 5 years, Texas increased 70% in its oil and gas production, Alberta 27%. The takeaway seems to me to be pretty clear. All the talk about greenhouse gas reduction has nothing to do with greenhouse gas reduction. And Leon and I have talked about climate change for many years, and CO2 is one factor, probably a pretty small factor in any kind of climate change. And it's also not clear which way the climate is changing. So Alberta is a minuscule contributor, as everybody knows, compared to China, India, Saudi, and the United States in terms of CO2 production. The attack on Western hydrocarbons has nothing to do with climate change. It is 100% political. In October, Brad Wall wrote a piece in the National Post setting out his views, quote, for a new deal with the prairies. A new deal between whom and the prairies? Well, the question answers itself. between Canada, the government of Canada, or as I've been calling it for a few years, Laurentian Canada, and the prairies. Wall drew attention to Justin Trudeau's words, which he characterized as nice. His words suggested it would be a good idea to have Western representatives in cabinet. But he also pointed out, Mrs. Wall pointed out, that we had such representation. The, quote, formidable Ralph Goodale, for example, in a government that brought us the current crisis. No Northern Gateway, no KXL, no TMX, changes to the National Energy Board, the No More Pipe Bill, Bill C-69, and C-48, the tanker ban. Wall also suggested that this time Canada might be serious in its desire for, quote, reconciliation. With all due respect to Premier Wall, this is wishful thinking. There is no possibility of a new deal with Canada. And that is the most important challenge that I'd like to leave you with. It takes two to tango, and I'll give you reasons why Laurentian Canada is not interested in dancing. What we can expect was given perfect articulation in yesterday's paper. Yves-François Blanchet, leader of the Bloc Québécois, had a pleasant meeting with Justin Trudeau. He said there was no national unity problem. He said this as the leader of a party that supports Quebec sovereignty. This indicates pretty clearly that the so-called sovereigntists in the Bloc are not serious. They are just the latest version of what Robert Bourassa called fédéralisme rentable, profitable federalism. And God knows it's been profitable for Quebec. This aspect of the problem with Laurentian Canada came out with great clarity in an exchange between Premier Kenney and Monsieur Blanchet. In a speech in Calgary, Kenney said, "If you are so opposed to the energy that we produce in Alberta, then why are you so keen in taking the money generated by the oil field workers of this province and across Western Canada? You cannot have your cake and eat it." And then he used an odd metaphor, pick a lane. Monsieur Blanchet replied, "You know what? I like my cake, and I will do what I like about it." On the same page of the National Post, Premier Moe said that independence from Canada is not the answer. Premier Kenney has maintained the same position. Both said they want a fair deal from Ottawa, not special treatment. And what is that? Well, Monsieur Blanchet was pretty clear. It's having your cake and eating it. And this miracle is possible because he knows that next year, another $13 billion cake is coming his way from Alberta. Monsieur Blanchet's condescending remarks, to say nothing of Monsieur Trudeau's comments on how fortunate we are to have so many Quebec francophones in cabinet, indicate the main contextual problem. Historically, the largest resource deposits are in the West. And this has been the way it has been since before Canada existed. Since Confederation, the population has been in the St. Lawrence Valley, but the resources are still here. Federalism was supposed to reconcile population and wealth, and for many years, Westerners believed it. That's why we've worked within the dominant parties to get our interests acknowledged. Then we tried third parties, Social Credit, the Progressives, the CCF, Reform. We've tried balance of power strategies and disruptive strategies, and none of them have worked. And the reason is simple. Laurentian Canada has never seen the West as part of a federation. The Canadian Federation, so far as they're concerned, is made up of the two old colonies of Canada, Canada East and Canada West, Upper Canada and Lower Canada, Ontario and Quebec. Atlantic Canada was sidelined within a generation after Confederation. And we were never considered part of the deal. So what were we? Remember Rupert's Land. Remember the Northwest and the Northeast Territories. Under British law, they were plantations. We tend to forget that. They were plantations, kind of like Jamaica was. And they were, quote, owned by the British Crown. When they were transferred to the Crown and right of Canada, the Northeast Territory was given to Quebec. And what about the rest of it? The rest was administered from Ottawa, as they said, for the purposes of the Dominion. This is why a serious political scientist in an earlier day, a guy I met once when I taught at McGill, he said that Alberta and Saskatchewan were, quote, provinces in the Roman sense. And, you know, some of you might know what that means. When I first read this book as an undergraduate, I had no clue what he was talking about. What he meant was Roman provinces were treated as conquered territories. They were administered from Rome or by Roman governors appointed from Rome, and in exchange for this beneficence, they got to pay tribute or taxes. And when Mallory said that, and I figured out what he was saying, I thought, aha, now these new Roman provinces were to be governed by Rome on the Rideau. We were seen as part of conquered territory, and we paid tribute. That is how Laurentian Canada treated the West from the start. That is why Donald Creighton, a great historian, the founder of the Laurentian School of Canadian History, called a wonderful book he wrote in the late 1930s, The Commercial Empire of the St. Lawrence. And the emphasis, when you read that book, is on empire. The implication, and Creighton didn't make it, is that we are a Roman province. Our problem is that we see ourselves differently. We think we're part of a federation and not a Laurentian empire. We've forgotten that Sir John A. referred to the West as a crown colony. Stupid us. Now, Premiers Moe and Kenney are politicians, not leaders. If the parade gets large enough, as Ralph used to say, politicians like to get to the front and pretend to lead. So it's certainly possible that enough Westerners will say they've had enough and demand their political leaders actually lead. And Premier Kenney has already indicated Alberta might leave the CPP, which would hurt Canada. That's the idea. Or we could leave employment insurance. Leon mentioned this. That would hurt Canada. That's the point. Better, we could leave supply management, particularly of milk, which would hurt Quebec. What a terrific idea. And he could hold a referendum to amend or revoke Section 36(2) of the Constitution Act 1982 regarding equalization. Now, the theory is, and these are some of the other obstacles we'll have to deal with, is that under the Clarity Act, about which we'll hear more later in this conference, a clear majority on a clear question would require Canada to negotiate. So that looks like a path to independence. But, first of all, the government of Canada, not the courts, decide whether the question is clear and whether the majority is clear. When John Major, who was on the court when this decision was made, or the Quebec reference was made, said, if we knew what a clear majority and a clear question was, we would have told you. So he kicked it back to Parliament, not to the provinces, and Parliament, but to the government of Canada to decide whether or not the criteria were met. Secondly, the government of Canada has a duty to negotiate, but who can compel them to do their duty? Third, the government of Canada can disallow or reserve any provincial legislation, which would obviously include any referendum legislation. Now, the disallowance has not been used since 1943, when, of course, it was used against Alberta, and reservation not since 1961, would suggest that, quote, by convention, these provisions in the Constitution are no longer of force and effect. But if the referendum on equalization was coupled to a referendum on independence or secession, it seems to me that Canada would quickly disallow both pieces of legislation. Indeed, if Saskatchewan were part of it, there'd be 4 pieces of legislation they'd be happy to disallow. Well, what then? Then all bets are off, because it would be as clear as can be that the legal path to independence is a fraud. If Alberta and Saskatchewan, maybe Manitoba, held referenda anyway, they would be illegal, and Canada would have no duty to negotiate. But this impasse should remind us that the problem is political. It's not legal, it's not constitutional. So here's the real problem. Let us say that Alberta and Saskatchewan undertake an intensive and effective educational program, and that a clear question, do you wish Alberta and Saskatchewan and perhaps other parts of Canada to be independent of Canada? And let's assume that the question receives an overwhelming support, say 95%. Then what? Then we have to consult both Leon's and my favorite modern political philosopher, Niccolò Machiavelli. Specifically in chapter 12 of The Prince, he said, good laws require good arms. And where are our arms? They are not in the Alberta Sheriff's Department as much as they're an effective police force. I've met some of them under unpleasant circumstances. That is the most important difficulty Alberta and Saskatchewan face, is that we lack an army. This means if we are serious, we must have American assistance. The implication of this necessity, as I said, are quite serious. We certainly have bargaining chips that the Americans would be interested in, which I can talk about later. Perhaps during the question and answer period, that'd be a time to do it. But the bottom line is that we have to seriously look at this problem, or else, as so many independence movements in this country, particularly from Quebec, over the past generation, and I should remind some of you may recall that Dave Berkison and I wrote a book about 20 years ago called Deconfederation, Canada Without Quebec, the French translation of which was Bon voyage et bonne chance, and we were vilified for that. Either we're serious or we're just whining.